Hello, and welcome everyone to SIA Partners webcast on LIBOR transition. My name is John Gustav, a New York-based partner within SIA Partners banking practice and head the LIBOR transition effort here. And most importantly, your moderator for this webcast. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen to our webcast. Over the next hour, SMEs from three of SIA Partners practices, LIBOR Transition Services Team, Corporate Lending Team, and Data Science Center of Excellence we'll discuss the impact of COVID-19 on LIBOR transition efforts and the path forward in 2020. We are also lucky enough to have Mark Shorzak from Sherman & Sterling's LIBOR transition team joining us to provide perspective from the legal side. A few logistical items to start, then we will jump right in. We've provided the timing of our discussions for each topic in the distribution email. So while we would love you to listen to the full hour, we understand some topics may be of particular interest for certain individuals. We received several questions as a result of our reach out. We will address those questions at the conclusion of our discussion. Lastly, we have included the contact information for all of the panelists on the webcast in the distribution email. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any additional questions or topics. So with that, let's get started. As everyone is aware, March and April have been unique times with the outbreak of COVID-19 and the resulting market disruption. Policymakers and LIBOR transition programs continue to move forward as best they can, but there have been macro shifts in financial markets through March and April that are likely to continue for months to come. I want to start this webcast by diving into the changes and shifts a bit, starting with Brendan Moriarty, a senior manager out of New York and one of our LIBOR execution SMEs at SIA Partners. Brendan, there has been a lot of commentary on the recent behavior of both Sofer and USD LIBOR. Could you speak to that behavior briefly to provide a backdrop?
Yeah, sure, John. So in March, we saw a flood of liquidity into the repo market, which really drove Sofer down. And that, along with the Fed slashing interest rates, brought Sofer down to a record low of 1 basis point. Oddly, LIBOR didn't track the credit markets during the period of stress, increasing only slightly. This kind of underscores the need to replace LIBOR and other alternatives. And at one point, the spread between LIBOR and 3-month commercial paper reached 250 basis points, demonstrating LIBOR's lack of response to the stress. I might add that 3-month LIBOR had 0 observable transactions underpinning it on March 16th, which is likely why it didn't track to the credit stress, and again, the need to replace it. Credit markets began to stabilize in April, but Sofer will likely remain very low for a little while due to the Fed intervention and investor demand for ultra-safe, short-dated assets. Going back to the transition, Sofer's contradictory behavior during the time of stress begs the question, is Sofer the right alternative for all market participants? I mean, for some banks, with their marginal funding costs less tied to the repo market, it may make sense for them to use an alternative that has a credit premium. Ameribor and ICE Bank Yield Index are the front runners there, but ICE's index is not ISO compliant, and it doesn't look like it will be. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Brendan, for that background. I think it's helpful now to look at what the resulting market and benchmark behavior has meant in terms of new issuance across interest rate derivatives, floating rate securities, and finally, lending products. Abul Hasnat, who is also a senior manager out of New York and another one of our LIBOR execution SMEs at SIA Partners, I'm going to start with you. What are we seeing in the derivative space?
Well, John, first quarter of 2020 was somewhat of a mixed bag, with big increases in traded notionals for IRDs referencing Sofer and SONIA, up almost 70% and 237% respectively, compared to fourth quarter of 2019, and decreases in TONA and Ester, and sharp decrease, about approximately 40.5% for Sarin. In terms of futures, at least in terms of Sofer tied futures have continued to see a steady increase in the first 2 months of 2020 in terms of average daily volume. March saw a slight drop off February highs and then a steeper decline in April. Aside from a dip in February, month-end open interest have remained flat compared to December 2019 numbers. Impact of progress on other RFRs will have on Sofer liquidity. Since the transition is happening in multiple regions in parallel, improved liquidity in any other replacement rate will signal further distancing from LIBOR and encourage more SOFR activity and improve liquidity.
Thank you, Abul. With that, Brendan, what can you tell us about the recent activity around floating rate securities and what it could mean looking forward for greater SOFR and ARR issuances?
Well, SOFR-linked public debt issuance really exploded in March from around 30 billion in February to almost 150 billion in March. I think SOFR issuance in April was about 100 billion. Significant volume came from GSEs, around 70 billion. The sizable supply from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac during March and April has reportedly been a result of mortgage forbearance expectations due to the COVID pandemic. It's also important to note that the sharp decline in overnight SOFR has now caused SOFR-linked floaters to generally underperform their LIBOR-linked equivalents. And obviously, a lot of this issuance has come from the GSEs. I think they're responsible for almost 80% of all SOFR issuance.
Thanks again, Brendan. It will certainly be interesting to see the impact of the recent issuances on the broader transition efforts in terms of how the USD LIBOR transition plays catch up in some of the issuance volumes. With that, I want to turn to two of our SMEs from our corporate banking practice, Shane Williams, our corporate banking practice lead, and Gustavo Bartzak, to highlight some of the recent challenges facing the loan and lending markets and what it means for LIBOR transition efforts.
Hey, thanks, John. So what we've seen is that with the slowdown in the economy and as a consequence of the pandemic, we observed an expected drop in new deals in the commercial lending market, especially when PPP loans are taken out of the equation. Just for reference, we'll be focusing on the commercial industrial segment, whose loans represent about 2.3 trillion as of January 1st, 2020. Since the beginning of the year, there's been a steep increase in C&I loan balances, reaching about 3 trillion as of April. Between early March and April, about 230 billion was drawn down on the revolving credit lines across all US industries. The rush caused a loan spike for Q1 loan growth at banks. The spike was driven by high levels of drawdowns on existing lines of credit, which went from a utilization average about 36% to above 45% in March. So when you look at where we were in January and where we are today, you're looking at a 30% overall increase in overall outstanding loan balances from the 2.3 trillion in January to the 3 trillion in March and April. These utilizations were very typical from high quality investment grade customers and from companies which were shoring up their liquidity as they prepared for challenging times ahead. This we saw in particular in very hard hit sectors like energy, manufacturing, airlines, hospitality, and retail, which may continue to see strong COVID repercussions in the near future. Of course, this expectation is because many fear there will be a credit tightening as COVID-19 continues and the return to normal becomes more drawn out. Gustavo, what are you seeing on your side?
Thanks, Shane. Another observed trend was a shift away from LIBOR as the benchmark for the C&I loans. This is likely due to a combination of monetary policy leading to record low prime rate and also a conscious effort to slowly wind down the dependency on LIBOR. But despite the decline in LIBOR issuances, there's been a very limited corporate lending or other lending product issuances tied to SOFR. This is simply because market participants are not ready to handle SOFR. There are still too many uncertainties and operational challenges, especially when it relates to conventions for compounding in arrears. And one other point I'd like to make is that although policymakers and industry working groups such as the ARK or the Risk-Free Reference Rate Working Group are committed to improving liquidity in the lending markets in 2020, recent disruptions and the fallout of COVID-19 have already proven to be hurdles for its smooth transitions from LIBOR. One example of that was the recent announcement by the FCA pushing out its industry milestone for the cessation of new issuances tied to LIBOR from Q3 to March of 2021 in an effort to ensure that there's enough available credit in the market.
Thanks, Gustavo. Another big recent setback worth noting relates to the Main Street lending program, where we saw the stimulus package was originally listed as having SOFR-based pricing options, but given extreme pushback from market participants and many of the large banks, the interest has since changed back to LIBOR, which is another hit to the transition efforts, as this now has to be included in the population of loans being reviewed before the LIBOR cessation. Back to you, John.
Well, John, probably the most important action in the last 3 months is actually the inaction or the unwillingness on the part of global regulators to delay this transition outright. Think about where we were in early March. It's unbelievable to think about this, but on March 2nd, the Federal Reserve, as administrator for SOFR, began publishing 30, 90, 180-day SOFR averages, as well as a SOFR index to support a successful transition away from US dollar LIBOR. On that same day, this was the day identified by the FCA and the Bank of England as the appropriate date for changing the market convention for sterling interest rate swaps from LIBOR to the sterling overnight index average, or SONIA, in the first quarter of this year. For reasons we all know, the world changed in March. Days after those announcements, on March 11th, COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. And days after that, as we all know, there were national state of emergencies and lockdowns declared across the United States, in the United Kingdom, and nearly everywhere else. And it's the reason why all of us are working from home today. So, you know, I think it's obvious and maybe important to state that, you know, the pandemic has clearly diverted attention and resources away from LIBOR transition efforts into other areas of need. And regulators have acknowledged that the challenges facing banks and the need for them to concentrate on the more short-term needs of their operations and their customers. While on a number of regulatory fronts, regulators have indeed delayed or altered their work or implementation on everything from, you know, certain rulemakings to examination and enforcement priorities and other areas. It's important to recognize that there's been no evidence of an outright delay to the phasing out of LIBOR. For example, in late March, the FCA, in consultation with the Bank of England and the Working Group on Sterling Risk-Free Reference Rates, they published a statement confirming that, and here I'll quote, "The central assumption that firms cannot rely on LIBOR being published after the end of 2021 has not changed and should remain the target date for all firms to meet," unquote. And then the FCA followed up on that statement on April 29th, reiterating that the very central assumption. And you know, it's also important to recognize that the FCA has offered some relief, of course. It is said that for new issuances of sterling LIBOR-based loan products expiring or maturing after the end of 2021, these should cease by the end of the first quarter of 2021. In effect, this gives banks an additional 6 months because the FCA, of course, originally set a Q3 2020 deadline. And then just last month on May 13th, the PRA and the FCA also suspended transition data reporting for some regulated firms. But it's important to keep in mind that there is no wholesale delay of the transition. We're just not seeing that right away or right now, either by the UK regulators or by the US regulators. And so the hard work remains, and banks are still very much plowing ahead in their transition efforts. John, what we're seeing right now is an acknowledgement by the regulators that institutions need to accelerate, not delay their institution efforts. And so let me unpack your question a little bit by focusing on three things. First, on the UK front, the regulators are saying that by the end of the third quarter of this year, lenders should be in a position to offer non-LIBOR linked products to their customers. And then at the end of the third quarter of this year, after the end of that quarter, lenders working with their borrowers should include clear contractual arrangements in all new and refinanced LIBOR referencing loan products to facilitate conversion ahead of the end of 2021. On the U.S. front, the ARC, which is of course the committee sponsored by the Federal Reserve Board and the New York Fed, the ARC recently issued a set of best practices and recommendations that it believes institutions should take in the near term. Now, in broad strokes, the ARC is recommending that new USD LIBOR-based cash products include ARC recommended fallback language, quote, as soon as possible, unquote, and that LIBOR stop being used for new products by the end of the third quarter of 2021, but even earlier than that for certain cash products like floating rate notes. The ARC is also recommending that third-party technology and operations vendors complete all necessary enhancements to support Sofer by the end of 2020. And that's obviously easier said than done. One of the things that we've all learned in this process is the incredible dependencies and linkages that many affected institutions have with their third-party technology and operations vendors, and the need for them to be fully brought into this transition because their work is very much important for the overall market's advancement. Third, John, I'll just mention a bit on timing. The ARC late last month said that institutions should have clear internal programs in place to prepare for a transition away from LIBOR across all of their relevant activities. And as part of that internal program effort, the ARC wants to see a rigorous assessment of exposures. And in the meantime, we have policymakers and market participants continuing to build on their work for market consensus on key ARR components, and so that's what we're seeing now. Certainly in this COVID environment, that the work is very much continuing. The ARC is putting out these recommendations, clearly not changing tone. I mean, there's not an effort or some type of discussion by ARC that institutions can put LIBOR on the back burner or off the burner altogether. Actually, quite the contrary. The ARC is clearly reminding institutions that they need to have plans in place, and there needs to be a rigorous assessment of exposures. And we can talk a little bit about what that means. But what is clear is that the prioritization of the transition is still very much at top of mind for regulators, including those on the ARC.
Mark, thank you. This brings up what I think is a key topic, so let's spend a few minutes diving into it. Brendan, let's start with you. Could you walk us through this concept of split preferences between the components of an ARR for derivative products versus cash products?
Yeah, sure. So I touched on this a bit earlier, and there are a couple different things going on here. It's basically the distinction between the preference for an overnight rate versus a term rate that is forward-looking. Sofer as an overnight rate causes some real challenges, except for derivatives. Derivatives are easy because they use an overnight rate on a daily basis now to discount or value a swap, and then they exchange margin. On the cash side, it's a bit different. They typically use term rates to generate interest accruals. That way you lock in your rate for the interest period and you know what you will owe or be receiving. This is helpful for both the borrower and the lender. The lender uses accruals for cash forecasting. And if you're Verizon issuing a $60 billion bond, you'll definitely want to know how much you owe in the next 3 months. Now, in the future, ARC has recommended a backward-looking calculation for Sofer interest calculations, which is a big headache. The borrower and lender no longer have that forward-looking view. Banks won't be able to generate daily accruals accurately. This is a nightmare for systems that need daily accruals. And for corporates and small treasury departments, some only have 2 or 3 people. Then they won't be able to build the tools to calculate it. Back to you, John.
Shane or Gustavo, in terms of lending products, could you provide a little bit more color on what is needed to mitigate this split in preferences?
Yeah, John, let me take that one. This is Shane here. So in the US, in our view, it comes down to a few things. First, the ability for the market to reach consensus on key SOFR components, such as A, the length of the term structure, B, the construct of the term structure, whether in advance or in arrears, and C, the methodology to calculate and the type of credit spread implied, static as recommended by Arks, or dynamic. Secondly, the ability to operationalize these components from a technological standpoint. There's a strong reliance on software vendors to develop robust solutions to be able to maintain the integrity of the complex calculations across the different facilities, outstandings, and payments. At the same time, these same vendors are relying on the financial institutions to quickly come up on a consensus on the conventions necessary for proper development. Even the seemingly simple things such as the use of business days versus calendar days for calculations, credit agreement language, or rounding standards are creating difficulties in coming to a consensus. And lastly, what is needed is a reasonable market-wide comfort with a compounding and arrears replacement rate, even if it is just temporarily. The ARC does not expect that a robust forward-looking rate term will be available for SOFR until Q1 2021. And given that the simple daily average in arrears is often seen as a poor representation of the time value of money, the next best alternative seems to be the complex compounded in arrears option. John, back to you.
Thank you, Shane and Gustavo. Maybe a little lightning round here. Brendan, Mark and Abul, if you had to pick one topic in terms of key next steps for the broader market to support alternative rate consensus and clarity for SOFR and other recommended ARRs, what would that be? Abul, let's start with you.
Well, John, I'd say client recovery and improved client readiness. It's worth noting that from being engaged with and speaking with our clients, customer outreach has been one of, if not the most impacted area of transition efforts. I think there's going to be some delays and definitely some challenges in terms of how financial institutions engage with clients to ensure client readiness.
Brendan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the move to SOFR discounting for centrally cleared swaps will drive a lot of the volume into the SOFR swap market. Banks won't want to deal with managing the basis risk there, and that volume will help with the development of a forward-looking term rate. Also, the ARC announced they were looking to publish a forward-looking term rate in the first half of 2021, but I don't think that will happen. Esther was set to go live for discounting the end of June. That has been pushed out by 5 weeks due to COVID. But it will help the transition in Europe. In the UK, the Estonia derivatives market is much deeper, so they're further along in the development of a term rate. And they're doing a 6-month test period before going live with it. So if that is the standard, I don't think the US will have a term rate by Q2 of next year. And it will be interesting to see if the US pushes out their date for SOFR discounting. It's October 16th right now, or 17th, but nothing yet. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Well, on the U.S. regulatory front, there's of course the ARC and various working groups associated with the ARC that are continuing working on various conventions and consultations in the market to support the development and kind of the success of SOFR. So that work is still apace even during this time, and it's going to be important work because this transition is not it's not a top-down transition from governments. It is a market-based change, and so it's important to have various market participants and stakeholders working through these various working groups in designing these very important consultations and conventions.
Thanks for that, gentlemen. I know we definitely want to circle back on the challenges with client outreach and contract remediation, but first, Brendan, we are currently doing this webcast from our homes. We haven't been in the office for weeks, and it's been very much the same for most of the world. What are you seeing in terms of the impacts on transition efforts caused by BCP and work from home arrangements?
I mean, well, I think first, it was a huge success story for these large organizations to move their entire employee population into a remote working kind of environment. So that has been definitely a positive. There are some small disruptions. Onboarding employees in a remote work environment is definitely a challenge. It takes a while, and we're kind of in the middle of kind of onboarding large amounts of resources for this transition. So there was a little bit of disruption there, but that has now ended. We're kind of back up to BAU. However, there were some knock-on delays related to that, mainly in the kind of the technology transition. I think another issue is for your offshore resources, especially in India, where they went to total lockdown, a period of time. That was a little bit of a challenge. And I think the other piece there is the smaller institutions that don't have those really mature and really strong kind of remote working environments, that they probably were suffering a bit. And the other thing with small institutions that, they were at a little bit of a disadvantage with this transition to begin with. So not being able to operate in a BAU environment throughout the COVID period, I think that could put them at a little bit of a further disadvantage, but I think we'll have to wait to see how that pans out.
Thanks for that, Brendan. Abul, shifting slightly to budgeting and resourcing, what are you seeing specific to those areas since the onset of the downturn?
Sure, John. In terms of budgets, in most cases, budgets have already been allocated to the transition effort, and we're seeing limited immediate impacts to transition budgets. This is not without exception, though. But I think the question becomes, how are budget planning processes impacted for 2021 if firms are still addressing fallout from the pandemic? That becomes a greater question. On the one hand, firms will need the potential play catch up for delays in 2020 as a result, may need to reassess best use of that money by adding resources to areas with potential high impact or delays. Conversely, additional budget may be needed to be allocated to non-LIBOR fallout related activities, which could create budgetary pressures from certain organizations. This also has to be viewed in the broader lens of how hard is the financial sector going to be hit by this, and what will the conversations in the 6 months as budgets are being defined. In terms of resources, with the exception of largest and most mature LIBOR transition efforts who have dedicated LIBOR transition FTEs, there has been absolutely a reprioritization of resources to meet non-LIBOR business needs caused by the recent market disruption. While the initial spikes in volume and request may have passed, it is very likely that organizations will need to develop a strategy to address the continued volume associated with defaults, forbearances, and bankruptcies that will be hitting different portfolios. The wave that is coming may influence servicing and LIBOR program delivery teams if they are intertwined.
Okay, thanks, Abul. I think that last point is particularly important as we wait and see how severe the fallout from COVID-19 becomes. I think this is just another example of the importance for transition efforts to remain engaged and committed to define project plans and key transition activities / milestones. Another activity and something that continues to be a challenge for the financial institutions that we want to circle back on is the operationalizing of compounded in arrears replacement rates. Shane or Gustavo, would you mind giving a quick update on what we're hearing from our clients and the market in terms of the challenges they're facing specific to operationalizing Sofer?
Absolutely. As Shane mentioned previously, the lending industry relies heavily on vendor solutions for their day-to-day operations. With that, many of our clients are currently going through contract renegotiations in order to perform the proper upgrades or implementations needed. So the approach varies on a vendor basis, where some software providers are absorbing the development costs necessary for the ARR upgrades and providing them as complementary services, while others require the purchase of additional functionalities. But in either situation, there's significant costs associated with the detailed testing of the new functionalities and training and FTEs. But with the complexity of the loan accounting system is such that even if a client is developing an in-house enterprise-wide ARR calculator, they're still likely to rely on vendor solutions for their loan servicing platform. But as we all try to keep up with the latest developments around LIBOR transition, we have observed that some of our clients are preparing by tackling some of the quote-unquote low-hanging fruits, which may involve the centralization of source of funding rates, the mapping of these rates into the different systems of records, and preparing a series of reports identifying the impacted facilities and outstandings related to LIBOR.
So let me just add to what Gustavo just said. The ability to calculate risk is another point worth noting. Without material historical data, financial institutions will struggle to develop robust models to calculate risk and predict rate behavior. But ultimately, the main challenges still revolve around the uncertainties in terms of components and calculation methodologies. For example, while compounding in arrears is a better representation of interest rate for a particular period, it also implies that the final rate would not be known until the end of the interest period, which is not what banks are used to seeing today when it comes to LIBOR, where they set a rate to date for the entire period. In order to mitigate this issue, market participants must then determine the standard approach for the look-back period and calculate day weighting. So as banks rely on vendors to develop the proper solutions, the vendors depend on the banks to come to an agreement on several conventions. But hopefully this consensus will be reached very soon, as time is certainly an issue at this point. Back to you, John.
Great. Thanks, guys, for that update. There certainly is a lot to be accomplished in the next 18 months with a number of key milestones across various markets. Before wrapping up our overall discussion, I think it may be helpful to turn our attention to an area that Abul highlighted earlier as one of the most recently impacted areas for transition efforts, client outreach. Abul, could you walk us through some of the challenges associated with client outreach and then how COVID-19 has delayed those efforts?
Sure, John. So prior to COVID-19 fallout, the major challenges around client outreach were managing the execution of client communication at scale, including things like developing and enhancing product-specific contract remediation strategies and communication plans, also enhancing and implementing product-specific internal and external education plans, as well as developing and enhancing governance and control processes specific to client communication. Other things that were also challenges are managing the need to proactive client communication in an environment of ongoing Sofer structure uncertainty. So it's very critical that clients are engaged in that kind of an environment. And also understanding client product and fallback preference. Oftentimes it'll be aligned with industry associations, but in case there's a difference, that's something that we would have to manage. After COVID-19, few things have changed, including our decisions on when and how to engage customers. So clients have been impacted, some more severely than others. And as a result of COVID-19, our clients are certainly taking a pause on client outreach in some instances. But more broadly, there should be consideration in terms of not only when firms should go back to their clients, but also as adjustments needed to be done to outreach strategies and timelines.
Well, John, short answer is they could. While the regulators are clear that the transition work must continue, they also acknowledge the importance of ensuring that the transition is fair, both to consumers and other stakeholders, and also in compliance with existing regulatory protections. Now, the various conduct, litigation, and regulatory risks inherent to a transition process all need to be thought through, obviously, when designing or recalibrating an existing enterprise-wide transition strategy. And look, a central part of that strategy is communication, is going to be communication. The Arks recent set of recommendations, for example, make clear that institutions should continue to have ongoing dialogue with their key stakeholders to promote awareness of the transition and their preparedness for it. I want to highlight just quickly 3 recommendations in particular that came out of the Arks set of recommendations. And one was for institutions to develop and implement an enterprise-wide strategy with clear objectives to proactively engage, consistently communicate, actually it's quite important there, and increase levels of education with impacted internal and external stakeholders. The second one was to identify, measure, monitor, control financial and non-financial risks of transition, establishing processes and oversight routines for ongoing management. And the third was that institutions understand the financial, the customer, and the legal impacts resulting from transitioning from LIBOR to Sofer, whether through fallbacks or otherwise, and then plan mechanisms for implementing those. Now, look, we're at the mid-year point almost. We're in June of this year. None of these recommendations should be jaw-droppingly shocking at this point. We've been hearing strands of this forever, seemingly forever. And what it suggests is that the regulators that are the members of the ARC are going to be evaluating institutional practices against these various recommendations, maybe not explicitly, but certainly in the broadest sense. And that, John, really gets us to the larger question in all of this, which is if you're an institution that's working on LIBOR right now and you're listening to this, the question that you ask yourself is, where do I stack up against my peers? And it's a question every institution is or should be asking right now. And fortunately, the folks in this call have thought a lot about that question for more than a year now. So when you're thinking about the ARC recommendations, I just blurted out 3 of those just now. When thinking about those and how your institution stacks up against them, there really is a strategic advantage to good advice and counsel in this area. And I think as the transition advances and regulators and examiners become more aggressive in their reviews, institutions are not going to want to be caught flat-footed here. This is something where preparation, doing your homework matters. And John, you mentioned just the whether there's kind of increased risk, particularly in the areas of conduct and litigation risk. I would just say that I think a central point in the transition exercise process is clear communication, and obviously that was one of the things highlighted in the Arks recommendation. But that's something that we're seeing institutions really give a lot of time and attention to. How are they communicating risks, not just in a 10Q or 10K or anything like that, or in some offering document risk factor disclosure, but how are you communicating this to customers in a relatively plain English sort of way, whether it's notices that are intended to be or expected to be delivered to certain customers in the future. How are you describing it? What type of information and contact points do customers have to learn more about the transition? And there's a lot of work, thoughtful work that can be done on that to help at least mitigate the risk of examiners second guessing how an institution went about that particular part of the transition.
Given the condensed timelines we just discussed and how some firms may look to artificial intelligence and automation to help mitigate some of those challenges, I want to ask Arnaud Buzzy from our Data Science Center of Excellence to speak a little bit to not only how organizations are using AI and automation to support the transition, but also some of the challenges as well as best practices we have observed when using AI and automation specific to LIBOR transition efforts? Arnaud?
Well, thank you, John. It happens that artificial intelligence and automation are currently at the center of new trends in contract management, where they are combined in order to automate the processing of documents based on information that can be extracted. The extraction of relevant information from those documents usually relies on the two AI fields that are optical character recognition and natural language processing. The first one has been around for more than 25 years now, with simple use cases such as postal code reading on letters or handwriting recognition for check processing. But the recent development of this technology since its creation has enabled to apply it to much more complex use cases involving recognizing and extracting tables, graphs, or complex layouts from documents. Natural language processing is a branch of AI whose purpose is to decipher and understand the human languages from a computer perspective. It covers a wide range of algorithms and topics, but the main tasks that are relevant to the use case of contract management are usually document classification. For example, simply detecting if the document mentions LIBOR or not, and named entity recognition. For example, to find the stakeholders mentioned in a contract.
Thanks, Arnaud. Would you mind discussing how you might go about actually designing a process using these techniques?
Well, yes. The process of automating contract remediation for LIBOR, for example, is just you need to feed the contracts to an optical character recognition module to extract the text they contain. And sometimes it happens that contracts are already digitized, so it's even better for use case. You then apply natural language processing techniques in order to extract the relevant information from your contracts regarding the automation process you aim to implement. And finally, you process your contract through a business process manager, for example, to apply the different required tasks that you had already defined. This is a process that we have often implemented in the data science team with, for example, the LIBOR bot that we have developed, whose purpose is to apply the two first steps to loan contracts in order to first detect if a contract mentions LIBOR or not, then extract contract characteristics and client characteristics, such as the ID of the contract and the client, the expiration date, names of persons that are involved, and finally detect the fallback index clause, which is required in Europe for contracts with variable rates and is an accurate and robust procedure that must be mentioned in the event of the disappearance of a benchmark index. So this is the heart of the transition.
That's very helpful. Arnaud, it might be useful to also talk a little bit about the pitfalls and best practices we are seeing in this space. Would you mind covering off on that as well?
Yes, of course, AI and automation is not a silver bullet, and such projects must avoid numerous pitfalls that can consume a lot of time and resources. The first one will be to avoid the prep work prior to ingestion regarding the characteristic of impacted portfolios and contracts, and by not integrating the error rate inherent to any AI model in the decision to automate. The second will be underestimating the complexity of the requirements. Since contracts can be very complex and sometimes very unique, this can be an obstacle for AI that mainly relies on statistics and comparisons between already known entries and newer entries. And the third one will be picking wrong technologies for the use case regarding the characteristics of the contract population. For example, by using an off-the-shelf solution not suited at all to the need. So there is a trade-off between increase of performance and time and complexity to automate that must be thought carefully, especially for a one-time usage for this transition. So based on those elements, we can deduce some best practices moving forward post-COVID-19. If you have progressed and understood how your portfolios and contracts have shifted, the transition teams should engage in spot reassessment of prior contract analysis and remediation approaches to ensure current approaches do not need to be redefined. Then, if you have not really started or have limited progress related to contract analysis and inventory, you should get started, of course, as soon as possible and get into the details of your contract so that understanding this characteristic is critical to the ability to define the appropriate approach for each project segment. Then, based on those characteristics, you can identify the right solution and allocate resources and define an approach relevant for each portfolio. And of course, the most important is to keep it simple and remember that it's a one-time analysis. So automating easy tasks such as just spotting contracts mentioning LIBOR can really narrow down the task and be done very quickly with a very high accuracy. But for more complex tasks, you need to think carefully of the benefits and the possibility to reuse it for ulterior projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnaud, for that. Now, Bull, last topic before we get to questions we received and wrap up. Given Mark's comments on the heightened risks associated with client outreach and legacy contract remediation, what are some of the best practices we are seeing in terms of how organizations are addressing these risks going forward?
Well, that's a good question, John. In terms of client outreach, some of the best practices we're seeing is that the outreach should be centralized in order to ensure consistency. So even though you're dealing with different rates in different countries, the strategy can be slightly different based on the progress of that particular reference rate, but the messaging should be the same. Another best practice we're seeing is that the outreach should be specific to the client's situation, and it should also reflect the entirety of the client's exposure. Meaning that if a client is trading multiple products with you, then you have to take into consideration the implication of trading all the various products. One example is loan products that could be hedged by derivatives. The way the remediation effort works for that client could be different from how the remediation works for a different client, because they could be relying on the protocol for some elements, and they could be relying on bilateral remediation for other elements. And you have to align the two, make sure that there isn't any kind of inconsistency. Another best practice we're looking at is for clients to manage competing priorities caused by COVID-19. So we all know that COVID-19 has shifted priorities, and in many cases, because the deadline for LIBOR transition is a few years down the line, some have deprioritized the outreach part of the LIBOR transition and have prioritized other aspects of the transition. So for instance, operational readiness. So these kind of reprioritizations need to be looked at in order to make a overall decision on client outreach as well. And finally, clients should also immediately be notified of any situations where there may be direct financial impact. And in this case, I'm thinking of the Eonia to Ester transition. So if there has to be a transition from Eonia to Ester, because the rates aren't exactly aligned, that discrepancy in the rates will have a financial impact on the product. And in those kind of situations, it's best practice to reach out to clients as early on as possible in the process to ensure that they're informed of, first, that there could be a financial impact, and second, to figure out exactly what that impact is and communicate it as early as possible.
Thank you, Abul, and all the panelists for their insights so far. We have time for a couple questions that we have received. I'll take the first one and hand off the second to Brendan. So the first question is, for the majority of global banking institutions, LIBOR transition program is driven centrally out of headquarters. Given IBOR requirements are different locally with different timelines, especially in APAC, What is the best approach to ensure local requirements are taken care of and that central decisions are fit for purpose for local regions? That's a great question, and I think it has multiple components to it. First, ensuring that headquarters has set expectations the same for all programs worldwide so goals are met. Metrics, milestones, and goals should be similar, although not identical, in order to produce some commonality in results. Second, it is important that there is a clear steering committee in each region who can interact. Leadership of the teams that communicate and exchange practices. There is a need to integrate approaches so there are common driven practices that harmonize but also leverage off one another. Third, it is essential that the local operations are effectively resourced in order to meet market expectations. It would not be uncommon that a large APAC bank, for instance, which is global in nature, would have potentially a much larger trading or lending business for global clients in an affiliate or subsidiary. So the support for them needs to be very substantial. Contracts can be more complex in one jurisdiction versus another, and hence need more support. Lastly, it is likely that the global operations have very different regulatory requirements. As a consequence, this institution needs to be prepared for both global regulatory reviews and adapt to those requirements and build out their capabilities accordingly. I hope that answers the question. Brendan, can you take the next one? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure, John. And just to preface kind of the commentary, the question was, what are the major differences between the US market and the international markets when it comes to kind of the LIBOR transition? And so I think the big one there is in the UK. The UK regulators are putting a lot more pressure on the industry to stop using LIBOR and to begin using ARRs. They're taking somewhat of more aggressive tactics, using deadlines for kind of using LIBOR or stop using LIBOR and starting to use the ARRs. And, you know, I think they can do that because their term rate development is a little bit further along in the US. So there's a little bit more appetite to potentially start using products or trading products that are tied to ARRs. And, you know, I think some of the other things the regulators are doing over there that's kind of a little bit more aggressive is they're doing kind of the on-site audits and inspections to ensure they're complying with the guidance that the FCA has kind of announced. So that's one thing. And, you know, and I think the other difference there is kind of in the US, you know, they're just, you know, the ARC is just announcing guidance, but, you know, they're not putting those aggressive deadlines and inspections on the US-based banks. And so that's kind of a big difference, I'd say. And the other one, you know, maybe generally in Europe is that, you know, Euribor is going to continue to exist. So that is kind of, you know, a reformed Euribor, but that will continue to exist, which is, you know, obviously in the rest of the globe, it's obviously, you know, ending. So that, and then from a global nature, I think something, you know, that is a bit challenging is that when it comes to, I guess, the risk models and updating them, you know, you have 24 currencies that, you know, go into these models. And so that is a very heavy workload. And, you know, getting those models updated, you know, especially in, you know, rate environments where they may be negative, it's a challenge to kind of calibrate the models correctly. So that is definitely something that we're seeing as a big challenge as we get ready, you know, to go live with discounting in October.
Thanks for that, Brendan. I know there were a few more questions we received that we addressed throughout the course of the discussion. So in the interest of time and sticking as close to our 1 hour target, I want to thank our panelists today, as well as those who took the time out of their day to listen to this webcast. We hope the insights provided today are useful and help you think through some of the current challenges you may be facing specific to the transition away from LIBOR. SIA partners, as I know Sherman and Sterling is as well, remains engaged in the market related to LIBOR transition efforts and supporting our clients through those efforts. As market conditions and responses from policymakers evolve, we will continue to provide insights on the impact to the transition. Please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or any of our panelists in the interim. Thank you all again for your time.